The Assyrian hegemony's Institute for Conquest Optimization occupied 17 levels of crystalline perfection above the cloudscape of their homeworld, where beings of supreme intellectual capacity spent their days reducing the art of war to elegant mathematical formulas. If one were to observe these creatures in their natural habitat, which consisted primarily of hovering over holographic battle simulations while making disapproving clicking sounds, one might conclude that they had confused warfare with a particularly complex chess problem. This, as it turned out, would be a remarkably prescient observation. The Institute's crown jewel was the predictive warfare algorithm, a computational marvel that could analyze any species' military history and predict their combat responses with what the hegemony's finest minds considered to be amusing precision. Across the galaxy, civilizations had fallen not to overwhelming force, but to the simple expedient of being mathematically outmaneuvered. The algorithm would process centuries of tactical data, identify behavioral patterns, and produce conquest scenarios with success rates that consistently hovered around 97%. The remaining 3% was typically attributed to computational rounding errors rather than any actual uncertainty, a distinction that would prove more significant than anyone imagined. On this particular morning, senior analyst Drax floated before a display showing the military evolution of species 7008 and 34005. The data streams painted a fascinating picture of tactical development, from crude tribal conflicts involving pointed sticks and aggressive shouting, through increasingly sophisticated applications of metallurgy and explosive chemistry, culminating in weapons capable of rendering their entire world uninhabitable. Standard progression, really, though the humans had shown a peculiar tendency to use their most devastating weapons primarily for intimidation rather than actual deployment. The algorithm had flagged this as suboptimal resource utilization with what could generously be described as computational smugness. Fascinating creatures, Drax murmured to his colleague Vex, gesturing at a particularly elaborate recreation of something the humans called the Battle of Thermopylae. Note how they consistently choose tactically disadvantageous positions for perceived psychological benefit. The algorithm classifies this as honor-based decision-making syndrome, quite common among primitive species. Vex's translucent appendages rippled with what passed for amusement among their kind. The projection shows they'll attempt to implement classical defensive formations when faced with orbital bombardment. Rather endearing, really. Like watching insects attempt to solve calculus. The display cycled through millennia of human conflict with the mechanical precision of a being that had never experienced an emotion stronger than mild academic interest. Ancient phalanxes gave way to medieval cavalry charges which evolved into trench warfare, mechanized combat, and eventually the sterile precision of modern military doctrine. Each transition was catalogued, analyzed, and reduced to probability matrices, with the thoroughness that had made the hegemony the galaxy's preeminent experts on turning conquest into a. What particularly amused the analysts was humanity's persistent habit of documenting their own tactical thinking. Military academies across Earth had spent centuries studying their own historical battles, producing detailed analyses of what worked, what didn't, and what might work better next time. This scholarly approach to warfare had made the hegemony's job absurdly simple. Rather than conducting covert intelligence gathering, they merely needed to access human educational databases and read the species' own tactical self-assessment. It was rather like having one's enemies provide detailed blueprints for their own defeat, complete with helpful annotations about weak points. The simulation shows optimal conquest completion within 8.3 standard time units, Drax announced, his tone carrying the satisfied certainty of a being who had never encountered a calculation that didn't resolve neatly. Initial orbital strikes will eliminate 73.2% of military infrastructure. Ground forces will implement predicted defensive scenarios 2.7, 4.1, and 8.9, and surrender protocols will be initiated when casualty projections exceed their documented tolerance threshold. The beauty of the system lay in its elegant simplicity. Why waste resources on prolonged campaigns when one could simply calculate the enemy's responses in advance? The algorithm had successfully predicted that the warlike Grimm would attempt their traditional berserker charges, allowing for precise counter-tactics that turned their greatest strength into a liability. It had foreseen the hive-minded Kalori's tendency to sacrifice individuals for collective advantage, enabling surgical strikes that paralyzed their decision-making infrastructure. Species after species, had fallen to the simple expedient of being understood better than they understood themselves. The only minor inconsistency in the human data was a persistent statistical anomaly in their combat effectiveness ratings. Across multiple historical analyses, human forces had demonstrated a troubling tendency to exceed predicted performance parameters during specific engagement types. The algorithm had flagged these instances as data corruption. After all, what rational explanation could there be for forces consistently outperforming mathematical projections? "Shall I initiate the conquest protocol?" Vex inquired, already knowing the answer. The humans had been studied, categorized, and reduced to numbers. Their defeat was not merely inevitable, it was mathematically guaranteed. Drax gestured his approval with the casual indifference of someone ordering afternoon refreshments. "Commence Operation Educational Opportunity. Let us provide these humans with a practical demonstration of superior strategic thinking." Across the galaxy, the hegemony's finest tactical minds prepared to teach Earth's inhabitants the difference between studying war and waging it. The irony of this particular lesson plan was entirely lost on them. The invasion of Earth commenced with the sort of methodical precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker, assuming Swiss watchmakers were in the habit of reducing entire civilizations to smoking rubble on schedule. The hegemony's battle fleet emerged from hyperspace at precisely the coordinates specified by algorithm subsection 4. Their ships hung in the void like geometric nightmares, all sharp angles and purposeful menace, broadcasting surrender demands in 17 different human languages, while simultaneously jamming every communication frequency except those specifically reserved for capitulation announcement. The first phase proceeded exactly as predicted. Orbital bombardment platforms eliminated key military installations with surgical precision, leaving civilian infrastructure carefully intact. After all, broken civilizations were far less useful than properly administered ones. The algorithm had calculated that destroying 73.2% of military capacity while preserving essential services would maximize psychological impact while minimizing reconstruction costs. The hegemony's finest tactical minds observed the unfolding destruction with the detached satisfaction of professors watching a particularly elegant proof resolve itself. Phase 1 completion at 99.7% efficiency, reported Fleet Commander Nix, his tone carrying the bland professionalism of someone reading quarterly productivity statistics. Human response patterns tracking predicted parameters within acceptable variance. They appear to be implementing classical defensive scenario 2.7, exactly as projected. Indeed, the initial human response had been boringly predictable. Military units had withdrawn to predetermined positions, civilian populations had fled to designated evacuation zones, and world leaders had begun the tedious process of negotiating surrender terms while attempting to preserve whatever scraps of dignity their hopeless situation allowed. For the first 6 hours and 13 minutes, the conquest of Earth proceeded with the smooth inevitability of a mathematical theorem proving itself. Then something went wrong with the equation. It began in what the humans called Eastern Europe, where a unit of their armored forces was supposed to be conducting an orderly retreat according to defensive scenario 2. Not the tactical redeployment the algorithm had predicted, not a strategic withdrawal to more favorable terrain, but a simple, direct, mathematically inexplicable about-face that sent them charging straight into the teeth of a hegemony advance force that outnumbered them 3-1. "Commander," tactical analyst Hep reported, his voice carrying the first microscopic crack of uncertainty that had been heard on the flagship's bridge in several centuries. "Human Ground Unit 7 Alpha is deviating from predicted behavior pattern." Nix floated over to examine the tactical display, expecting to see some minor computational error that could be quickly corrected. What he saw instead was a scenario that made no logical sense whatsoever. The human unit wasn't retreating, regrouping, or attempting any recognizable tactical maneuver. They were simply advancing straight into overwhelming enemy fire, while broadcasting what the translation protocols identified as extremely impolite language across all communication frequencies. Perhaps a leadership failure, Nix mused, though his certainty was beginning to develop hairline fractures. Single-unit commanders can sometimes make irrational decisions under stress. The algorithm accounts for this variable, except the aberrant behavior wasn't limited to a single unit. Across the globe, Human forces were beginning to deviate from their predicted response patterns with increasing frequency. A naval group that should have been surrendering instead launched what could only be described as a suicide attack against a hegemony orbital platform. Air Force squadrons that had exhausted their ammunition were attempting to ram enemy fighters rather than landing at the designated capitulation zone. Ground forces were abandoning defensive positions not to retreat, but to advance against impossible odds, while making sounds that the hegemony's linguistic algorithms couldn't quite categorize. Something between war cries and expressions of profound personal affect. Sir Hept continued, his voice now carrying distinct overtones of what other species might recognize as concern. We're receiving similar reports from all operational theaters. Human forces are, well, they appear to be ignoring mathematical reality. This was when Commander Nix first encountered what humans would have immediately recognized as the fundamental flaw in the hegemony's approach to warfare. They had studied human tactics with exhaustive thoroughness, analyzed human strategies with mathematical precision, and calculated human responses with computational certainty. What they had never bothered to investigate was why humans fought in the first place. The algorithm had noted, with clinical detachment, that humans often chose to continue fighting even when victory was mathematically impossible. It had classified this behavior as suboptimal resource allocation, and factored it into projections as a minor inefficiency that could be exploited. What the algorithm had never considered was the possibility that humans might not particularly care about mathematical impossibility when someone was shooting at their planet. In the city that humans called London, a unit that should have been requesting surrender terms instead began fortifying a position around what their cultural databases identified as a When hegemony ground forces moved to clear this strategically insignificant location, they encountered resistance that defied every principle of rational warfare. The humans weren't fighting to achieve any tactical objective. They were fighting because someone had interrupted their afternoon drinking, and they appeared to take this as a personal insult requiring immediate and violent redress. Similar scenes were playing out across the globe. Humans were defending shopping centers with the determination their ancestors had reserved for sacred temples. Civilian populations were joining military units not because of any strategic calculation, but because they seemed genuinely offended by the presumption that they should simply surrender their planet to beings who hadn't bothered to ask nicely. Commander, Hep reported with the hollow tone of someone watching fundamental principles collapse around him. The algorithm is experiencing difficulty processing current data streams. Human behavior patterns are exceeding all projected parameters. Nix stared at the tactical displays showing human forces doing things that violated every principle of logical warfare. They were treating the invasion not as a mathematical problem to be solved, but as a personal affront to be answered. The hegemony had come expecting to fight an army. Instead, they were facing an entire species that seemed to have taken their arrival as a deliberate insult. Recalibrate the projections, Nix ordered, though his voice carried the uncertainty of someone trying to solve an equation that had suddenly sprouted variables that shouldn't exist. Factor in elevated emotional responses. What the hegemony was about to discover was that they had made the classic mistake of confusing knowledge with understanding. They had studied how humans fought, but they had never grasped why humans fought. And that distinction was about to become the most expensive lesson in applied anthropology the galaxy had ever witnessed.
By the 18th hour of what should have been Earth's routine subjugation, the hegemony's predictive warfare algorithm was experiencing what could generously be described as a complete nervous breakdown. If algorithms could develop drinking problems, this one would have been face down in a digital bottle of computational alcohol, muttering equations that no longer added up to anything resembling coherent military theory. The problem, from the hegemony's increasingly panicked perspective, was that humans had apparently decided to reject the fundamental principles of logical warfare in favor of what could only be described as aggressive emotional responses. Every tactical manual in the galaxy agreed that when faced with overwhelming force, rational beings would calculate their odds, assess their options, and make the mathematically sound decision to surrender. Humans, it seemed, had never read those manuals, or perhaps they had read them and decided to use them as kindling. "Sir," tactical analyst Hept reported, his voice now carrying the distinct tremor of someone watching the laws of physics file for divorce. "Human Unit 12 Bravo has somehow achieved a 340% casualty ratio against our ground forces, while I'm not sure how to categorize this behavior, sir. They appear to be operating under the tactical principle of extreme personal irritation. Commander Nix examined the battlefield reports with the growing realization that he might need to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. According to every principle of military science, the human unit in question should have been eliminated 6 hours ago. Instead, they had somehow turned a doomed defensive action into what could only be described as an educational seminar on the practical applications of righteous indignation. The unit's commanding officer had reportedly responded to the hegemony's surrender demand with a suggestion that involved anatomically impossible arrangements and a request that the invaders perform certain acts upon themselves that would have violated several laws of physics. Rather than the predicted demoralization, this response had somehow spread to other human units, like a particularly virulent form of tactical inspiration. Across the planet, similar scenes were unfolding with increasingly surreal results. In what humans called Australia, a group of their military engineers had weaponized their local wildlife, turning the invasion into what battlefield observers could only describe as a nature documentary directed by someone with severe anger management issues. Hegemony forces found themselves under assault by creatures that seemed to have been specifically designed by a universe with a twisted sense of humor and an apparent grudge against alien invaders. Commander, Senior Analyst Drax reported from the Orbital Command Center, his usual intellectual smugness replaced by the hollow tone of someone whose worldview was actively decomposing. We're receiving casualty reports that don't conform to any known mathematical principle. Human forces are somehow achieving tactical victories while being simultaneously defeated. This paradox was epitomized by an engagement in what the humans called the American Midwest, where a surrounded and outnumbered unit had responded to inevitable defeat by deciding that if they were going down, they were taking as many invaders with them as mathematically possible. What should have been a minor mopping-up operation had somehow transformed into a lesson in applied thermodynamics, with human soldiers demonstrating creative applications of explosive chemistry that had never appeared in any tactical database. The hegemony's ground commanders were reporting scenarios that violated everything they understood about rational combat behavior. Humans were using their own damaged vehicles as improvised weapons. They were turning civilian infrastructure into elaborate death traps. Most disturbing of all, they were coordinating these activities while maintaining what their intercepted communications suggested was a running commentary of increasingly creative insults directed at the invading forces. "Sir," communications specialist Yex announced with the bewildered tone of someone translating poetry written by beings who had never heard of metaphors, "we're intercepting human battlefield communications that appear to consist entirely of challenges to our forces' parentage and suggestions for recreational activities that would be both physically impossible and legally questionable." What the hegemony was discovering, to their mounting horror, was that they had fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between human tactics and human emotion. They had studied the mechanical aspects of human warfare, the formations, the weapon systems, the logistical considerations, while completely ignoring the psychological engine that drove the entire enterprise. Human military doctrine wasn't just about achieving tactical objectives, it was about channeling the species' apparently limitless capacity for taking things personally. The algorithm had noted that humans possessed what it clinically termed elevated aggression responses, but had classified this as a minor behavioral quirk that could be factored into projections as a standard deviation. What the algorithm had never considered was the possibility that human aggression might not follow standard deviations at all. Instead, it appeared to operate on some sort of exponential scale that increased proportionally with the level of personal offense taken by individual combatants. Commander, Fleet Medical Officer Kex reported with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "We're receiving casualty reports that suggest human forces are somehow becoming more effective as they sustain losses. This violates every known principle of combat psychology." The phenomenon was spreading across all theaters of operation like a particularly aggressive form of tactical inspiration. Human units that should have broken under pressure were instead becoming increasingly dangerous as their situations became more desperate. Rather than the predicted demoralization, impossible odds seemed to trigger what could only be described as escalating levels of personal affront at the presumption that they should simply give up and die quiet. In the Pacific Ocean, A human naval unit that had been reduced to a single damaged vessel had somehow managed to sink 3 hegemony cruisers through what appeared to be pure vindictive determination, combined with creative interpretations of standard ramming procedures. The vessel's final transmission had consisted entirely of what the translation protocols identified as extremely rude suggestions regarding the invaders' ancestry and leisure activities. "Sir," Pep announced with the tone of someone delivering news of a fundamental breakdown in the nature of mathematics itself, "the algorithm has stopped providing projections. It keeps displaying error messages and what appears to be crying emoticons." Commander Nick stared at the tactical displays showing human forces doing things that should have been impossible, according to every principle of logical warfare. They weren't just fighting against mathematical superiority, they were rejecting the entire concept that mathematics should have any bearing on their decision to continue causing problems for uninvited guests on their planet. The hegemony had come to Earth expecting to demonstrate the superiority of analytical thinking over primitive emotional responses. Instead, they were receiving a comprehensive education in why emotions existed in the first place, and why evolution had apparently decided that the ability to become extremely annoyed was a survival trait worth preserving across millions of years of natural selection. The hegemony's retreat from Earth was conducted with the sort of hasty efficiency typically reserved for evacuating burning buildings or fleeing particularly aggressive swarms of carnivorous insects. What had begun as Operation Educational Opportunity had transformed into what fleet historians would later classify as an extremely expensive lesson in why theoretical knowledge should not be confused with practical wisdom. Fleet Commander Nick sat in his command center surrounded by displays that showed casualty figures that seemed to mock the very concept of mathematical probability. His forces had achieved every tactical objective the algorithm had specified, controlled every strategic position the projections had deemed crucial, and maintained overwhelming numerical superiority throughout the engagement. By every measurable standard, the hegemony should have been accepting Earth's surrender approximately 37 hours ago. Instead, they were retreating from a planet whose inhabitants had somehow managed to turn military defeat into a form of extremely aggressive performance art. "Final casualty assessment, sir," reported tactical analyst Hep, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had watched the universe reveal itself to be far stranger than previously advertised. "Human losses, approximately 12% of military capacity. Hegemony losses, 63% of assault forces, all orbital platforms, and what appears to be our collective confidence in the reliability of mathematical models." The numbers told a story that violated every principle of rational warfare. The humans had lost almost every major engagement according to traditional tactical metrics, yet had somehow managed to inflict casualties at a rate that defied every projection the algorithm had produced. More disturbing still, their effectiveness had seemed to increase proportionally with their losses, as if military defeat had somehow been transformed into a motivational tool. "Sir," communications specialist Yex added with the bewildered tone of someone translating messages from a species that appeared to exist in a state of permanent personal offense, "we're still receiving transmissions from Earth's surface. They appear to be victory celebration." The translation protocols are having difficulty with several phrases, but they seem to involve suggestions about what we can do with our advanced technology and where we might consider storing our tactical superiority. This had been perhaps the most incomprehensible aspect of the entire debacle. According to every conventional measure, Earth's military forces had been comprehensively defeated. Their major installations had been destroyed, their command structures had been disrupted, and their casualty rates had exceeded every threshold the algorithm had identified as a breaking point. Yet somehow the humans had interpreted these results as evidence that they had won. Senior analyst Drax floated before a display showing the final engagement statistics, his usual intellectual arrogance replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been systematically demolished. "They're celebrating because we're leaving," he said with the tone of someone solving a puzzle that revealed the entire universe to be far more irrational than previously suspected. "They consider our tactical withdrawal to be proof of their victory, regardless of the mathematical impossibility of that interpretation." The revelation was simultaneously simple and profound. The hegemony had approached warfare as a problem to be solved through superior analysis and computational power. They had studied human tactics, calculated human responses, and predicted human behavior with what they had assumed was scientific precision. What they had never considered was the possibility that humans might not care about being scientifically analyzed. Commander Nix reviewed the final battle reports with the growing realization that his species had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of conflict itself. They had treated war as an intellectual exercise, a complex equation that could be solved through sufficient data and computational resources. The humans had treated it as something far more primitive, and as it turned out far more effective. A personal disagreement that required immediate and violent resolution. "Sir," Fleet Medical Officer Kiex reported with clinical detachment, "psychological analysis of captured human combatants reveals a common theme. When asked why they continued fighting against impossible odds, the most frequent response was, and I'm translating this as accurately as possible, because they started it." This simple phrase encapsulated everything the hegemony had failed to understand about their chosen opponents. The humans hadn't been fighting to achieve tactical objectives or fulfill strategic goals. They had been fighting because someone had shown up uninvited to their planet and begun shooting at their things, and they had taken this as a personal insult that required immediate correction. The algorithm had analyzed thousands of years of human military history, catalogued their weapons, studied their formations, and calculated their tactical preferences with exhaustive thoroughness. What it had never bothered to investigate was the simple fact that humans fought, not because they had calculated their odds of success, but because they had decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of mathematical probability. "Initiate full withdrawal," Nix ordered, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had received an education in subjects he had never intended to study. "Mark Earth's system as inadvisable for future educational opportunity." As the hegemony's surviving forces retreated to what they hoped was a safe distance, the Institute for Conquest Optimization began the humbling process of recalibrating their understanding of warfare. The predictive warfare algorithm would require extensive modifications to account for variables that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant: emotional investment, personal offense, and what humans apparently called the principle of not taking crap from anyone. The final irony was not lost on the more philosophically inclined members of the hegemony's academic community. They had come to Earth to demonstrate the superiority of analytical thinking over primitive emotional responses. Instead, they had learned that emotions weren't a bug in human military effectiveness, they were the primary feature. The humans hadn't fought despite their feelings, they had fought because of. Years later, when hegemony military academies taught courses on unconventional warfare scenarios, Earth would serve as the primary case study in why intellectual superiority should never be confused with tactical advantage. The humans had taught the galaxy's most analytical minds a lesson that no algorithm could have predicted. Sometimes the most sophisticated strategy of all is simply refusing to accept that you're supposed to lose. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all, and it apparently had a particular fondness for practical jokes played on beings who confused knowledge with wisdom, analysis with understanding, and mathematical models with the infinitely more complex equation of what happens when you annoy an entire species that has spent millions of years perfecting the art of taking things personally. The hegemony had studied human tactics, but they had never accounted for human fury. It was a mistake they would not make again, assuming of course that their pride could recover sufficiently to admit they had made a mistake in the first place.